We're moving. After second grade was finished, we were about to begin a journey that would last about 10 years. Or in my case 9 before I left home. Moving always included a Greyhound bus. One that made feel like I was going to throw up the entire time I rode. The diesel fumes gave me nausea and headaches. I would sit by the driver, often they didn't let you open the windows. My mother had this routine. She would buy tickets to somewhere we could afford, like the next town over. We each got to take 2 boxes of our stuff, clothing, toys. Everything else was left behind. Greyhound allowed 2 boxes per ticket. Our lives were literally in 2 boxes. When we arrived, we found a motel for a night. Then went to churches begging for money, declaring our aunt lived a couple of towns down. All we needed was food and money to keep us and for tickets. The 1970s and 1980s were the decades of prosperity and great change in the United States. We were in the Vietnam War until 1974. The soldiers that returned from World War II were heroes, came home to parades. The soldiers that were conscripted, drafted, or ordered to fight in Vietnam returned to be spit on. Except those that were able to escape to Canada. The family was still the focal point of society, though now divorce was more prevalent and women were going into the workforce. Even if there were still jobs off limits to them, they were making headway in education, could get mortgages by 1980 and their own checking account. Maggie never really participated in any of that. I have had many theories, but I think it was trauma, low self-esteem and fear that kept her behaving the way she did. There was also a certain amount of independence and adventure, traveling around like a hobo. I will never know for sure her reasoning. Churches would put us up in low-budget motels. They had arrangements with locations. Then they would provide vouchers for a restaurant to eat at. I always loved that we could eat real meals. The sheets were always clean and neat. I called it a con, but it worked for her, the poor widow woman with 3 small children. By this time, Debbie's dad had passed away. They had not spoken in 3 years, but Maggie was his last wife. He died of alcoholism, though his death certificate indicated a coronary issue. However, out of his death she got a great new story for her travels and money each month. Maggie ran her whole life until all her children were gone. The Greyhound bus ambled down the I-5 corridor southbound through McMinnville and then into Salem for the summer. Now to address our pets. Since I was a girl, I have loved animals, bugs, fish, birds, zoo animals, dogs and cats. So did Maggie, except she did not feed them or take care of them. When we left McMinnville, she locked the dog we adopted in the house, left the toilet up and put the cat outside. She said the landlord would find them. It broke my heart, and I had nightmares of them starving or cold. Yet at 8, I had no power in the situation. Those animals haunted me much of my life. I told her it would be kinder to put them down than to abandon them. This would not be the only time animals I loved would be neglected and abandoned. By the end of the summer, we had made our way to Southern Oregon, a little town called Medford. It is where I started 3rd grade, and by Christmas we were in Oxnard, California. I think something must have triggered Maggie, so she left the state before Christmas. We normally did not travel during the school year as we had free lunch, and the welfare required us to be in school. Thank God for free lunch, as we would not have eaten. I often wondered if that is why she traveled in the summer. School was out, and the churches were generous in those days with feeding the poor. Legally, every jurisdiction was separate, no computers that kept records, especially in Oregon at this time. So a woman questioned about the care of her children could leave the state, and the authorities just let it go. Women were being helped that had children welfare and government food. With that came regulation and accountability. At least in Oregon, that was the case. I believe the trauma from her losing her family followed her for the rest of her life. She was constantly on guard all the time around bureaucrats, like the Children's Services and really any official. Even school teachers and administrators caused her alarm. We were forbidden to reveal anything about our home, and trained with TV how to respond if asked. As a child, I was afraid of authority figures all the time. They would take my mother away, and she was all I had. I also started to feel like I was misunderstood sometimes at school. I talked too much, chatty is how they referred to it. I was told I had potential if I could just sit still. From second grade on, I walked all the way to school by myself. I didn't mind, in fact I came to like my independence. However, there is no way I would have let my son walk that far at 7 or 8. Though I spent much time alone, my mother was always around somewhere. I spent free time playing with kids in each new neighborhood. It was still that kind of an era where children were considered safe outside in our neighborhoods. Within 10 years that would change with the abduction of Johnny Gosch. One of my favorite things is that there was always a vacant lot around the area. It was overgrown, full of weeds. As children it was a place for adventures, games, and we loved it. We stayed out until dark, though I would go back and forth throughout the day. As afraid of authorities as we were not afraid of playing alone with other children all day without supervision. Maybe it was the time we grew up in, maybe it is because kids were tough, we would make fun of the weird man that lived in the spooky house, we knew how to run if someone scared us, or stand together against someone who might bother us, though I don't remember ever experiencing that when I was that young. Like I said, Maggie was afraid and dependent on social services, which I am sure was horrific. I remember benefits for poor people who didn't work were better in Oregon. Though we spent time in California and Washington, Oregon provided us the most steady assistance. So much of our life was there. They also took care of the hippies in the communes that grew pot too. When we lived in Cave Junction, there was a commune just down the road from us. They tried being organic, self-sustaining, and yet failed miserably. They did drugs, had a lot of swinging parties with the adults. The children and animals were malnourished, the kids uneducated and ran around unsupervised. Debbie brought home a starving dog from there, and it was run over by a car in front of her. It was an interesting time to be a kid. As tough as our life was, my mother always looked down on the hippies. She was really conservative, more from the early 60s in style and culture. Oregon was very progressive, so every group from California or any other part of the country seemed to converge there in the 1970s and 1980s. There were actually signs on the highways that said, "Don't Californicate Oregon." When I got sober, I did this analysis at my childhood travels and realized that between the first grade and when I graduated from high school, I had lived 20 different places in a 12-year period of time. And it began after second grade when she had my brother. Like I said, I feel like that's when she changed forever. Maggie was much more depressive, much more critical, withdrawn, and spent more time in bed. I was adventurous, and by 8 I could ride a skateboard. I borrowed another kid's skateboard. In Oxnard, we lived in this Hispanic community where the adults were kind to me. A woman taught me how to make tortillas. I was trying to learn to feed myself. And it's also where I tried to light a gas stove, and it blew up on me. My mother was nowhere to be found. Maggie would walk sometimes and I never knew where she was going. She would just leave and I was in charge. She took Tim with her. I was sort of a bully, part kid and part grown up with very poor skills at problem solving. My mother screamed or was depressed. I screamed and hit Debbie sometimes. I aged out of it by about 11 or 12 when she grew as tall as me. I have since made amends to her many times for my childhood issues. At that time I became friends with her. That year we left Oxnard by spring and ended up in a little town called Talent, Oregon. It was rural and poor. I got lice there and Maggie chopped my hair off about an inch around my head. It was humiliating to look like a concentration camp victim. We were the weird kids more every day, and always the new kids. Maggie sent me to third grade on my own. I had just turned 9, and the first day coming home I got lost. This was a small community, and I kept walking thinking, eventually I'm going to recognize something and I'll be able to go home. It took me about an hour or 2. When I finally got home, Maggie didn't even notice I was late and there was no dinner. Then back to Portland.